So I'd like to listen to the first 3 tracks in Akira the Don's Watts Wave number 4. And if you're not familiar with Alan Watts, I put up his Wikipedia here. Just briefly, he's known for popularizing Buddhism in America in the 50s. And he was born in 1915, to give you an idea of how old he was then. He died in 1973 at the age of 58. I think he was married 2 or 3 times. He became a Christian minister around 1945 in the Anglican Church, I believe, and then 5 years later, he was divorced and no longer a minister. He couldn't reconcile his Buddhist beliefs with the church, and he also had an extramarital affair, so of course his wife had the marriage annulled. He had a drinking problem at the end of his life. This is a guy who was brilliant from what I can see, but of course flawed, like we're all flawed. So I know if you're listening to this and you're familiar with my Karl Barth intro and my commentary on the comment section of that, we're going to learn something from a flawed person, because we're all flawed people. So just because the man had divorces and affairs and a drinking problem doesn't mean he didn't have something to say to us. If you want to go into his whole history here, I would encourage you looking up, if you don't know what he is or what he's about, to look up this information yourself, because I don't want to just read a Wikipedia to you. Like I said, I want to listen to these tracks, the first 3 tracks. I might do the whole album, a commentary on a whole album, but in different parts. And what I want to focus on here is how Alan Watts brings. Now this album is focused on Hinduism. He brings an Eastern belief system, let's say Hinduism, and he brings it very close to the Christian belief system, and at points you can see they meet and they touch, and I want to focus on those points and on just some of the interesting thought experiments he goes over as well. The first track is about what kind of dream you would dream if you had the power to dream anything you wanted to. And Akira the Don put it, set it to music. He took these excerpts from different videos and set it to his lo-fi vapor mix.
Akira.
The Don.
He's got clout.
Before I begin, I want to go over this image here that I guess Akira made. I'm not sure who does his visuals. I think he does all his visuals of Alan Watts in this sort of, maybe is it Vishnu? It's one of the Hindu gods that I think comes at the end of times. Although I think in other pictures I've seen, that symbol there, that signal he's making with his hands, is in that picture, but then there's also weapons and stuff that the figure holds.
I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. And you would, of course, be able to alter your time sense and slip, say, 75 years of subjective time into 8 hours of sleep.
This is something I've often talked about with my friends, and I call it time dilation. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but it's fascinating to me. And I used to picture it in terms of technology. So I'm very much one of those where I used to be a singularitarian, following Ray Kurzweil and the materialist view of things, and how fast technology is advancing and what we could be able to do with such advanced technology. And one of the minor things, considering how advanced it is to allow yourself to experience extended amounts of time in very short real-life time frames. So just as a computer can process information and very quickly, let's say it can process 24 hours of video in a microsecond, so can your brain, if it's properly enhanced or configured, process the experience of time and all that goes with it in a short amount of real time. And again, we're getting into simulation kind of theory, that there's a simulated time and a quote real time, base reality time. I guess you'd have to say that this would be our quote base reality, and the simulation that we're running, this, what he says, 75 years of subjective time, is the dream time that we would experience in the base reality of 8 hours of sleep. And so what kind of simulation would you run if you could do this, if you could live a lifetime in 8 hours of sleep? And one of the things that got me thinking about this way back when I was a kid, when I was watching Star Trek The Next Generation, there's a really great episode. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Star Trek, but there's a great episode where the ship encounters a probe of some kind, and the probe scans the ship and ends up doing something to Captain Picard. They don't know what. He kind of falls to the ground in a coma. But while he's in the coma, he is actually experiencing a simulation of what it's like to be on the homeworld from where this probe comes from. And the purpose of the probe was to let someone experience a lifetime of that culture, the last days of that civilization, as a way of sort of memorializing the end of that civilization, because shortly thereafter that planet was destroyed or something. And so they sent out these probes so that other people could know what they were like. And so Captain Picard lived out a whole lifetime in which he thought his old life as Captain Picard was just a dream or just a psychosis. And they convinced him that he's really this other guy living on this planet in this other culture, and he has a wife and children, and he knows how to play this little flute and so forth. And so he has this, when Captain Picard comes back out of this coma after an hour or two, he has experienced a whole life living on this other in this other culture. And so that gives him a whole different perspective on his current life and you know, his current future, because he already lived a whole life, right? And so what could humanity be like if we could live lifetimes during our quote in our base reality sleep time? Just think about that for a second, if you will.
You would, I suppose, start out by fulfilling all your wishes. You could design for yourself what would be the most ecstatic life. Love affairs, banquets, dancing girls, wonderful journeys, love affairs, banquets, dancing girls, wonderful journeys, gardens.
So it looks like the captions are not quite correct there. I thought they would be correct, but this is the first time I'm watching it with captions on, in case you don't understand what he's saying. He's talking about banquets, and it says quit on the screen for some reason. Banquets and dancing girls, not bouncing girls. That's kind of hilarious. But so essentially what you might do for the first couple of months of these lifetimes of dreams, you might just live out fantasies, pure ecstatic life, as he says, where you're indulging all the 7 deadly sins, let's say, because that's what humans tend to do. But you know, so you're gonna have although great music is not part of the deadly sins, obviously, but the girls and the food and all that stuff certainly counts. But what happens? He's gonna get into what happens afterwards. What might you do when you're done with those kind of fantasies? And one of the things that always worried me, actually, it's to the point of a worry. It's a very slight worry about the future of technology and modifying myself if I were to do that kind of thing, is that if you enhance your intelligence and if you enhance your brain and so forth, maybe all the things I wanted to do and all the things I look forward to doing and so forth in such a reality would all change. It would all be different, and I would change, because I'm so much smarter with enhancements genetic enhancements and technological enhancements, that then you have completely different interests, and you might be a completely different person, given the interests and so forth.
Music beyond belief. Music beyond belief. Music beyond belief. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. Any dream you wanted. Any dream you wanted. Any dream you wanted. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. And then after a couple of months of this sort of thing at 75 years a night, you would be getting a little taste for something different. You would move over to an adventurous dimension where there were certain dangers involved and the thrill of dealing with dangers. And you could rescue princesses from dragons and go on dangerous journeys, make wonderful explosions and blow them up. Eventually get into contests with enemies. And after you've done that for some time, you'll think up a new wrinkle to forget that you were dreaming.
I don't know if my mic was muted during that. I just gave an exposition. So after the 5,000 years of indulging yourself, you might want to do something else, and it sort of speaks to our nature. And if you're not familiar with Alan Watts's, he had a friendship with Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell is famous for writing about the hero's journey, elaborating on all the steps that a classical narrative takes in developing their hero, and how that is reflective of human nature. And what Alan Watts is talking about here is our human nature, that we can't just live in an indulgence. Eventually we're going to want something more than just indulging our fantasies. And this sort of connects to Westworld and my Westworld video series, is that there is a part of Westworld that is just indulging your fantasies, but then there's also another part that's a call to adventure, and you can choose to fight the good fight and defeat bad guys and rescue people and so forth, but only if you choose to, right? So some people, they may not choose, but most people probably would, because it's part of our general human nature to want something more, right? Something more meaningful. And so he's saying after 2 months or like 5,000 years of just indulging yourself, you're going to want this call to adventure, and you're going to want to go out and slay some dragons and so forth. And I think it's really interesting where he's going with this, and you're going to see a connection, I think, to Christianity, and I think he brings it up. But when I had a friend listen to this recently, and he didn't catch this connection at first. I think he was only listening to it superficially, but you really have to closely listen to this and follow it to understand the Christian connection.
So that you would think it was all for real, and to be anxious about it, because it'd be so great when you woke up.
This is interesting. This little wrinkle is that not only would you have these adventures, but you would forget that you were dreaming, so that you would actually it would be very real to you. So you would experience anxiety. That's part of the adventure. If it's an adventure without anxiety, then it's not a real adventure. It's not, if you can't really get hurt, or you believe you can't really get hurt, then it's not really that real, right? And this goes back to Westworld again, because there's a character in Westworld that is seeking the ultimate adventure, and he can't find it in the park. He's done everything in the park. He's indulged himself all, for 30 years, and he's done every quest there is to do in the park. And he's looking for this final quest because it might make things real. It might add some kind of stakes to the game. And what he's seeking is life and death stakes. And it's the addition of danger that makes life real and in some sense worth living.
I wonder other on things. How far out could you get? What could you take? What dimension of being lost, of abandonment of your power, what dimension of that could you stand? You could ask yourself this, because you know you'd eventually wake up. After you'd gone on doing this, you see, for some time, you would suddenly find yourself sitting around in this room with all your personal involvement, problems, etc., talking with me. How do you know if that's not what you're doing?
So this is interesting. This is where I make a Christian connection. He's like, so like children that dare each other to go further and further, how far out could you go in abandoning your power and abandoning your abilities to manipulate this fantasy world and to forget who you were, how powerful you are to be the constructor of and creator of this fantasy world, this dream world. And so you growing on adventures is one level. So going from fantasy then to adventure fantasy, and then the next step is to forget that you're in a fantasy, so the adventure seems real, the stakes seem real to you. And then he adds this part about children daring each other to go further. You have this inclination or this desire to say, well, now how far can I go in danger and in abandonment of my power? And I think you can go as far as, or you might say, we've seen someone go as far as being born in a manger where animals feed and dying on the cross, humiliated, and being a god, being obedient to death and the limits of a human body. That's a pretty far out abandonment of your power. And it's an interesting way of thinking if you want to think about simulation theory, what you might do with that and what maybe has been done with that. It's interesting to think about.
Could be. Because after all, what would you do if you were God? I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. Any dream you wanted. Any dream you wanted. Any dream you wanted. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted to. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted to. 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 I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted to. What would you do if you were God? 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 What would you do if you were God?
So one of the things he's trying to get across with this question of what would you do if you were God is this Hindu conception that we're all God, everything around us is God, and it's God playing in a dramatic sense in the world. And so the revelation for each individual self is to realize that they are God, that they are part of the God self, the higher self. And it's what is it? They say Atman is Brahman. That's one of the phrases you're going to hear in Hinduism. It's an interesting thing to think about. I don't personally buy into that notion. I think there's some problems with that, especially when you get down to ethics. But again, it's worth thinking about and as a thought experiment. And this music is definitely entertaining.
Looking at it from another way, we push technology to its furthest possible development. And we had, instead of a dial telephone on one's desk, a more complex system of buttons. And one touch, beep, would give you anything you want. Aladdin's.
So he's saying, you know, if we had a technology sufficiently advanced where we can hit a button and it would give us anything we want, like Aladdin's lamp with a genie in it, right? That's the old mythical conception of this. You know, what might we wish for, and what might be how might that technology develop? And I find it interesting that what he's going to say here is that there's going to need to be a button called surprise. And if you look at Google can sort of give you any answer you want, and there's a button called I'm feeling lucky. I don't know if it's related to what Alan Watts is talking about here, but I do find it an interesting parallel.
You would eventually have to introduce a button labeled surprise. 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 Because all perfectly known futures, as I pointed out, are past. They have happened, virtually. It is only the true future is a surprise. It is only the true future is a surprise. So if you were God, you would say to yourself, man, get lost. And it's strange that this idea is obscurely embedded in the Christian tradition, when in the Epistle to the Philippians, St. Paul speaks of God the Son, the Logos, the Word of God, who is incarnate in Christ, and says, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought not equality with God a thing to be clung to, but made himself of no reputation, and humbled himself, and was found in fashion as a man, and became obedient to death. Same idea. Same idea as the idea of the dream. That very far out dream. Same idea as the idea of the dream. That very far out dream. Same idea as the idea of the dream. That very far out dream. Same idea as the idea of the dream.
It's kind of interesting how important this idea of dream is to Alan Watts, to Hinduism, maybe to Buddhism, with the idea that reality is Maya, an illusion. And further on in the album, he gets into the word origins of illusion as play, and how important it was to Jung, and what it revealed to Jung, and how that then affects Jordan Peterson. If you're here because you like Jordan Peterson, you know, the dream is an important idea to Peterson, and you know, you can see historically it's been welling up in us as human beings forever. And there was a recent talk on Vanderklay's channel. I forget the man's name. It was an elderly Dutch guy who was a minister at one point, and he talked about going out on a retreat, and the guy who sent him out on the retreat out into the wilderness said, you're going to experience something that's going to like change your life. Like, it's the change you're going to experience something out there that's going to be like a religious experience. And the man said when he went out into the woods, there was giant redwood trees, and he was kind of bored, and he whittled a stick, and he fell asleep a few times, and so forth. And what I was thinking is that it's, oftentimes you can see in the Bible that it's in a dream that God speaks to some people in the Bible. And it's when you're sleeping, this comes up in The Master and His Emissary in McGilchrist's book, that you can't always be, your mind can't always be set on a specific task. You have to at some point be open to everything and nothing, right? And it's sort of, your consciousness is sort of always directing you to be focused on one thing or the other, or maybe you're trying to multitask a couple of things. Same idea, you're busying your mind. And your unconscious is sort of being squashed while you're conscious. And when you're sleeping, the idea is that you don't have conscious control. Sometimes you do, then you have something called a lucid dream. But most times you don't. And it's your mind just doing its own thing. And that's when you're receptive and you're perceptive, I think, to what you need to be perceiving many times. And that's when, historically, we've seen stories of the divine revealing itself through the dream to people. So something to consider as you listen to the music.
Getting as extreme as you can get. As you can get. As you can get. And so this then is the basis of the Hindu view of the universe and of man. The Hindu looks upon the universe as a drama. The Westerner, of course, looks upon the universe as a construct, as something made. And it is not therefore insignificant that Jesus was the son of a carpenter.
I think that's a great last line for this track. This is the end of that second track. I'm going to go into the third track. But you see, he brings up the contrast between the idea of the world as a drama and the idea of the world as a construct. God, the clockmaker, constructing something mechanical and setting it off. And of course, Christians have another that's more like a deism idea, but still, we think of God as the creator versus God, as the Hindus believe, as someone who's acting in the world. Now, Christians also believe God, well, some Christians believe God acts in the world, but we just have different ways of thinking about it. But there's an essential, broader view. Does God act in the world? And now different religions have different theories about how and why and if God does act in the world. You hear Jordan Peterson often talk about how our beliefs are not necessarily expressed verbally, but rather we first act them out in the world. So I think he goes back to the Old Testament and says, Moses went up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, but these were rules that the Jews, that he observed, that they were living by already. And so he just codified what was working and brought it down. And now, we're not speaking historically or metaphysically necessarily, but we're talking about the psychological reality, is that we act things out, and then we observe how we're acting, and then we codify that as a verbal expression or as a written expression, as something that we ought to do because we see that it's working. And if we see that it's not working, then we see that we ought not to do it, right? That's the point. One of the points Jordan's making is that there is an important way of thinking, and it's not just about the construct of the world, as in the material scientific construct of objective sense data. It's also about the dramatic element of the world, the psychological element of being in the world, living in the world, relating to others in the world, and acting it out as part of a drama. And this goes back also to Jung, about how we live out the archetypes, or we live out the narratives that we see in our great stories, because the stories are reflections. The great stories, the truly great stories, are reflections of, accurate reflections of human beings, of our psychology, of the way we relate to one another. And that human nature has not changed over the past 2,000 years, if you're talking about the biblical stories. And you can go to older stories that they're based on. And when it comes up in those debates with Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty that we need to update our stories, or we need to update the morals and ethics that we live by, it can't be 2,000-year-old ethics. The comeback, the retort to that should be, that you see Jordan try to say, is that human nature has not changed. We're still this being that's half animal and half divine. We're caught between the bottom of the world of creatures, the creatureliness of our animal self, and the very top of the world, the God of the sky, of the stars, what our potential could be. It's out there, it's divine, and we're sort of this being that's in the middle. We can sense and feel our animal-like nature, and we can see the scientific history of its evolution, but we can also have a mind that reflects on it, and reflects on things higher than the material world, and things that are potentially outside the material world, such as a divine being. And so I think it's really interesting, and here Alan Watts says there's a reason why Jesus was the son of a carpenter. Like, that's not just a random fact that's part of the story. It's, and if you want to say that every part of the story was historically accurate, well, then it was an embodiment of this metaphor. The metaphor was embodied historically and lived out.
The Chinese looks upon the universe as an organism, as we shall subsequently see. But the dramatic idea is basic to Hinduism. Now, you can speak about Hinduism on two levels at least. One I will call the metaphysical level, and the other the mythological level. If you speak on the metaphysical level, you can speak only in negative language. You can say what the divine, the ultimate reality, is not. If you speak on the mythological level, you may speak of what the divine is like. Because myth is not a falsehood, as one uses the word in a sophisticated way. A myth is an image, a concrete image, in terms of which man makes sense of the world.
So myth is the image in which man makes sense of the world. And if you're listening to this, you're going to hear Northrop Frye, William Blake, you're going to hear Jordan Peterson in these words, Carl Jung, and what he's talking about things in mythological terms or metaphysical terms. He's going to get more specific about this, and it relates actually to something I talked about in my Fearful Symmetry series, my Fearful Symmetry Friday series, about a perfect God is no God. I think that's what I termed it. And Frye talks about this in Fearful Symmetry, that when you have this God concept, if you start to extract it in a philosophical sense, in a Greek sense, where you're just looking at the abstract notions of what God is, you can only talk about it in negative language. It's what Alan Watts just said. It's what Frye says. It's a solid idea in theology. So God becomes infinite. That's the negative in, or eternal, the negative e. He's outside of time. He cannot be contained, and so forth. It's all negative, cannot. But then you can talk about it in mythological terms, where you have God the Father, God the Son, and so forth. And now you have an image and this is something you can relate to and understand that's positive, or God is love, and so forth. And it's metaphorical. So Alan is going to continue on here, and he explains it very well. I think he does a very good job of just explaining it in 1 or 2 sentences, you know. So take a careful listen here.
Which man makes sense of the world? Thus, the idea of God the Father, or God the Maker, is a myth. Because it's an image. Because it's an image. And Christian theologians distinguish equally between 2 kinds of theological language, which are respectively called cataphatic and apophatic. Apophatic language is negative, as when we say God is infinite and eternal. Cataphatic language is mythological, as when we say God the Father, God is love, and all the positive designations. We are not saying God is a cosmic male parent, but is analogous with the Father.
That last part is interesting. He says, we're not saying God is a cosmic male parent. He's analogous to the Father. And this is something that I think is hilarious when they were trying to smear Jordan Peterson when he was saying that certain things are feminine and certain things are masculine, like you have Mother Earth, Mother Nature, and so forth. And, you know, that's just because people don't understand the mythological language. They don't understand, if you want to go back to my Missing Link or Fearful Symmetry video series, they don't understand phase 1 language. That's more poetic. It's more about analogy and metaphor, and they think you're literally talking about something being a male or female or some odd, more third phase language that's concrete instead of symbolic.
We are not saying God is a cosmic male parent, but is analogous with the Father. We are not saying God is a cosmic male parent, but is analogous with the Father. So with Hinduism. So with Hinduism. What I'm going to speak to you in, first of all, is the mythological language of Hinduism. The idea of the universe as the big act. The universe is God playing hide and seek with himself. For God is thought of fundamentally to the Hindu as the self. The self. The cosmic I.
That's where I'm going to end this. I think this is going now onto the 4th track. I just wanted to do the first 3 tracks to sort of give this video some... it's already going quite long. And if I did the whole album, it would be way too long of a processing time for my computer to process it, and then YouTube to process it, and so forth. But I hope you enjoyed listening to Alan Watts and Akira the Don's music. And if you haven't listened to the whole album, Alan Watts number 4, The Watts Wave, give it a listen and let me know what you think in the comment section. And again, if you like a lyric analysis, if you like this kind of commentary, give the video a like and make sure you subscribe. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
Where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
a node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.